Hello and welcome to our program. We are delighted that you could join us today. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland in College Park. And today's program is being co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and by the Sociology Department's Critical Race Initiative. None of this today would be possible without the assistance of Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. So thank you very much to her for organizing today's event. When you join this virtual meeting, you are muted and your video is off. The program is being recorded. And by participating in this program, which is a virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice possibly being recorded. And you will have an opportunity to submit questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen when the time comes in this program. So I'm really excited about today's program for two reasons. One is that June Thomas is a friend of mine, but also a very important colleague of mine. I have watched her professional work evolve throughout the decades, and so impressive. So it's really a pleasure to have her. I'm also very fortunate today to meet a new friend, and I hope this will be a start of many other interactions with him. And of course, that is Professor Julius Fleming, whom I will introduce to you in a minute. But first, I want to just mention a little bit about the structure of the program today. I will introduce both of our, both Dr. Thomas and Dr. Fleming first, but then Dr. Thomas will give us a presentation about her book, after which Dr. Fleming and I will moderate the program. So that's the way we will move forward. So the book is Struggling to Learn an Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. It is published by the University of South Carolina Press. It describes the battle for equality in education during the civil rights era, which came at a cost to Black Americans on the front lines. In 1964, when 14-year-old June Manning Thomas walked into Orangeburg High School in South Carolina as one of 13 Black students selected to integrate the all-white school, her classmates mocked, shunned, and yelled racial epithets at her. The trauma she experienced made her wonder if the slow-moving progress was worth the emotional sacrifice. In Struggling to Learn, Thomas revisits her life growing up in the midst of the civil rights movement, before, during, and after desegregation, and offers an intimate look at what she and other members of her community endured as they worked to achieve equality for Black students in K-12 schools and higher education. So with that, it's really my honor to introduce Professor June Manning Thomas. She is Mary Frances Berry Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan. Her scholarship has focused on the impact of urban planning decisions on post-industrial cities and Black communities. To help increase diverse presence and voice among urban planning faculty, she co-founded the Planners of Color Interest Group, part of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. She held as founding co-chair of the she led as founding co-chair of the Planners of Color and later served as vice president and then president of Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. This was 1213 to 1215 to 2015. Sorry, 2013 to 2015. Her study of the role of spiritual leadership in planning began with a book she published on planning progress lessons from Shoghi Effendi Rabbani, and has continued with other articles and service projects. Her book, Redevelopment and Race, Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit, is the standard history of redevelopment, race, and urban planning in Detroit's 20th century planning. It received Paul Davidoff Prize for Best Book, published in 1997 and 1998, on the theme of social equity in urban planning. She's also co-author of many other books on cities, race relations, and urban planning, including Urban Planning and the African American Community, The City After Abandonment, and Mapping Detroit. And of course, as you know, her latest book is Struggling to Learn: An Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. Professor Julius Fleming Jr. is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Maryland at College Park. Specializing in Afro-diasporic literatures and cultures, he has particular interest in performance studies, Black political culture, diaspora, and colonialism, especially where they intersect with race, gender, and sexuality. Professor Fleming is the author of Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Unfinished Project of Emancipation, published by the New York University Press in 2022. He is beginning work on a second book project that explores the new geographics of colonial expansion and their impact on Afro-diasporic literary and cultural production. His work appears in many, many journals, too many to name. He has served as associate editor of Callaloo. Professor Fleming is currently serving as associate editor of Black Perspective, which is an award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society, a very important blog that I recommend highly. He has been awarded fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute, and the Social Science Research Council. Thank you for both of you for being with us today. And it is now my pleasure to turn the time over to Professor June Thomas.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to be here with you. I've long admired the activities of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace and the work Hoda is doing. So this is really a wonderful honor to be with you. And I hope to give you some insight into this book that was recently published. It's been out for about a month now, or a little bit more. So I did prepare a presentation to kind of help to present some of the main ideas. And so I will share screen and talk about that in that way. So as Hoda pointed out, this is actually an intimate history, excuse me, of school desegregation in South Carolina is the subtitle. And it is a book that is a history, but also a memoir. So it has many components that are historical archive researched, and then other components that are personal history, family history. I had several main purposes of the book. One was to help bring to life a crucial period of school desegregation and civil rights history. I was somewhat concerned that the narratives we have about particularly the classical civil rights era were somewhat flattened in popular thought. We were devolving into talking about certain heroes, but not really talking about the lived experience of many people who lived through the civil rights movement. So helping people to get a sense of that lived experience was one goal of the book. To explore how white supremacy repressed Black education and life. So I grew up under a system of Jim Crow, and I was just fascinated by the implications of that history for where we are today, where we have come from in terms of the lingering racial disunity in this country and the effects of legitimized white supremacy from that era, to explain how many Black communities nevertheless educated their children. And so again, unfortunately, many times we focus on the effects of racism, but we do not acknowledge that there were communities that managed to survive and thrive, and in particular, to educate their children. And so I used examples particularly from South Carolina, to talk about how Black people were able to work through that particular era and to educate their children in spite of many disadvantages, and then to find strands of hope for an interracial future. And so I thought that it might be useful to just talk about what were some of the signs of an interracial future that existed at that time. And I did it in a couple of ways. One was to talk about the joint efforts of Black activists and white allies. And the other was to spotlight groups that were attempting to bring about a better interracial future. So the main locus of activity is my home county and my home city, Orangeburg, South Carolina, which is just about in the middle of the state of South Carolina. The county is the blue mass that you see on the screen, and the city of Orangeburg is about where the dot is pointed. And you'll see there'll be other maps, but it will be possible to pick out Orangeburg. And I chose this because I knew it well, because I was born there, I grew up there, and it seemed to me to be an important locus of civil rights activities, as well as an important locus of the education of Black people, in part because it was the site of two historically Black colleges. At that time, they were just simply Black colleges. And this was in a very small town. And so the town was unique in at least that way, but in other ways as well. And of course, as has been introduced, the pivotal, event in this particular narrative is the desegregation of the local high school. I was one of several children and youth who were sent forth by our parents and by the local NAACP chapter to desegregate schools that had been segregated for decades. And this particular photograph, which was taken by a wonderful photographer in our hometown, Cecil Williams, shows these children and youth. And this would have been a few months before we entered the high school. And so all of the people you see standing are either children who were or teenagers who were being sent forth, or their families. And in the far right with the glasses standing next to the little girl is my father. And the very small child is my younger sister, Michelle. And I'm in the row on the front. I have a striped dress on and I'm wearing eyeglasses. So the temptation was to write about that experience, to write about what we experienced. As it said in the short description of the book, this was a period of prolonged ostracism and harassment that we suffered, depending on whether we went in as ninth graders, 12th graders, or sixth graders. But for us high schoolers, it lasted for pretty much the length of our stay. So I entered as a 10th grader. So that would have been 3 years of bullying, ostracism, and harassment. So it would have been very tempting to write about that, but I actually wanted to write about broader things. So although that story is at the heart of the book, you actually don't encounter that particular experience until the middle of the book. Instead, I was wondering about those exterior forces, what had happened to bring about this moment, what had people done to create the situation that existed at that time, how had racial oppression affected the Black people in particularly South Carolina, and how did they respond? So I was looking to broaden the story. And so in order to do that, I expanded the time frame quite a bit. So instead of looking just at the 1960s or 1950s, I went all the way back to the 1860s, and then the narrative pretty much takes the story of school desegregation up until 2020 with some comments after that. But what I wanted to do was to show that this was an extended, long effort, both to repress Black education as well as to uplift it. And so I started in 1869, which happened to be the date of the founding of one of the 2 Black colleges in my hometown. And of course, it was also a few years after the Civil War when we did have quite a bit of intervention by white philanthropists who were trying to assist the cause of Black education in some way by helping to establish colleges. And so the narrative does cover a pretty long period of time, what some people refer to as the long civil rights era. When I completed the book and I was developing a conclusion chapter, I realized that what had happened was I had given a litany of both destructive forces and constructive forces throughout the period of time that I was studying. And this is a familiar motif to many people. In particular, Hoda mentioned Shoghi Effendi, who was the leader of the Baha'i community. And as she mentioned, I've written another book about Shoghi Effendi. This was one of his favorite motifs, to write about the destructive forces taking place in society, as well as to look at the constructive forces. And I realized somewhat in hindsight that that's exactly the way the narrative had evolved. That throughout it, I had talked about quite a few destructive forces, but also there were a number of constructive forces that were at play. So very quickly, what were those destructive forces? Well, they included, of course, the period after Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, the purposeful crippling of Black public education, which was a motif, a theme throughout the book, this idea that as part of post-Reconstruction, there was an effort to make sure that Blacks did not receive public education even above 2nd or 3rd grade. There was violent repression, although that was not a very strong theme. It came up throughout the book that where there was any kind of pushback from the Black community or even just to keep it in line, there was the exercise of violence against that community and its members, grossly skewed expenditures for Black schools. This was a pretty strong theme. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. And then racial segregation and public accommodations. This was not so strong a theme, but I did spend a good portion of one chapter just drawing a picture of what that was like and how that essentially supported this myth of racial superiority against the Black race, white superiority over Blacks. So let's look at some of these destructive forces. One of the ones that was really quite obvious was the sorry state of Black public schools. And one of the pictures that is on here on the left shows that basically this particular school, which was actually built on church grounds, was probably built by the local Black community, because one of the ways that the white community maintained this oppression that was characteristic of the whole 20th century was to purposely underfund Black education. And this was definitely a force of repression. Even at the college level, and this on the right shows the two colleges in my hometown, Claflin, then college, now university, and South Carolina State College, now South Carolina State University. This is a map of what their campuses looked like approximately in 1951. Especially for the state school, you could see the effects of this repression in the purposeful underfunding of college education for Black students in the state of South Carolina. State was the only college that Black students could attend in South Carolina, and it was very much the underfunded stepchild of the state of South Carolina. We also know something about the state of physical denial of accommodations for school children. One of the most important sources for this is a 1937 report by actually planners associated with the National Resources Planning Board. This is one of the few direct connections with my own profession. There were actually planners hired to go out and assess the conditions of all of the public schools and some of the private schools for both Blacks and whites in the state of South Carolina. And there's much data that's available in that particular report, which is online. And so I was able to use that as sort of a benchmark to see what the conditions were in 1937. So very quickly, the school population was just a fewer so-called colored, by which they meant what we call Black nowadays, compared to whites. But they were pretty evenly divided because many of the Black children were actually in private school. But you can see with this map, a blow by blow for each county assessment of how many of those public school students were Black and how many were white. And you can see that in some counties, there really were more Black students than white students. But the main purpose of this report was to assess physical facilities. And so they looked at things like water supply. This map shows that there were many, many schools in the state of South Carolina that didn't have any running water. They also didn't have toilets. They didn't even have legitimate latrines. And you can see in terms of water supply that the Black dots are the Black schools. The map looks like it's almost completely all Black schools, and just occasionally you will see white dots, which are the white schools, because their schools were so much better than the Black schools. And here, I think it's a little easier to see this map. You can see that the high schools were unevenly given. And so Black students are the black dots, and their high schools were so few compared to the white or clear dots, which were the white high schools. So one of the reasons for this is that the state and the various school boards put extra money into making sure there were white high schools, especially after the 1920s. But they even passed a special tax in order to do that, but they did not use that tax money to pay for Black schools. And so you had this great unevenness in terms of conditions. Many of these counties and school boards were very happy if children only went up to the second or third grade, and they would not provide money beyond that. As it happens, actually white education was pretty bad too, but as is the case in many situations, whites were pitched against Blacks, low-income whites were pitched against low-income Blacks, and whites were given just a little bit more so that they would continue to support racist ideology. And of course, this is one of the maps from my book, so I cleaned up some of the data from that report. This particular map shows my home county, Orangeburg, and also Clarendon County, which is the site of a major court case, Briggs v. Elliott, which became part of the big 1954 Brown v. Board of Education for Topeka, Kansas. So my county was right next to the county that led to the Supreme Court decision that struck down state-enabled school segregation. This is data that kind of shows what I've just said, that Blacks were not given high school education. In the 20s, there were no Blacks that had finished public high school. 25 was when that new legislation went into place. So you see a jump in the number of white high school graduates. And then I show these 1930, 1935, 1940, and I highlight the 1935 statistics because that's the year my father graduated from high school. And so until I wrote this book, I had no idea that my father was one of only 303 Black graduates of high school. He never said that. I don't know if he knew it. We just knew that somehow Black people were not getting to or finishing high school. And we knew we were very fortunate that he was able to get that far and to go further. But when you look at the numbers, even in the 40s, 10 times as many whites as Blacks finishing high school. But as I showed you in a previous map, the numbers of pupils was about equal. But Blacks were being channeled into wage labor, into peonage, into remnants of the plantation economy. They were not expected and were not supported in gaining education. Another repressive force then was the staunch defense of this system of white supremacy. And so in one chapter of the book, I talk about this. It was impossible to really do a complete description of the nature of this system of racial oppression. And so I chose to talk mainly about the opposition to the 1954 Brown decision that served as a proxy and allowed me to look at archival data that documented how the journalists and politicians and citizens groups such as the White Citizens Councils, how they defended white schools and how they denigrated Black people by saying that they were not worthy of schooling and certainly not worthy of being in the same classroom as white children. So those were some of the forces of destruction. But as I've mentioned, there were also constructive forces that were taking place at the same time. So the main one that I highlight in the book is the Black community's constructive resilience. That is, its ability to make a way out of no way. So I spend a great deal of time talking about the Black community that I knew and other communities around the state, and how they managed to live with nobility and flexibility and to inculcate a certain number of values in their children, and even to teach their children by offering, if not public school education, then private education, and in other ways, creating schools, creating colleges or supporting colleges in ways that allow the community to survive and even triumph in the face of such racial oppression. I also found it important to talk about the white allies. I put occasional there because they were vastly outnumbered by the larger society, but it was also important to highlight the fact that there were people who offered assistance for the Black community in allied efforts. Richard Thomas, historian Richard Thomas, calls that the other tradition of cooperation for the sake of racial unity and racial justice. And I also talk about the Baha'i community. So one of the themes of the book is, one of the sub-themes is my interest in religion and how that evolved throughout this period of time. So I was in part looking at how were religious communities responding to this situation and to this effort to desegregate schools in the face of white supremacy. And I only found one religious community that was trying to live together without segregation within their own ranks. And that was the Baha'i, very small, but very important Baha'i community. And then, of course, a homegrown civil rights movement, which was centered in part in my hometown and actually in my church. And so I spent a great deal of time talking about that homegrown civil rights movement as a force of resistance. So I showed this image before, but I'd like to just say that in part, these were constructive forces. So it's true that the school on the left was in rough shape, but it was built by Black people for Black people. There was a determination to educate children, even if the local white school board refused to do so. And you see signs of this tenacity throughout the 20th century. And on the right, of course, Claflin College and South Carolina State College, now universities, they are also testimonies to this effort to educate at a higher level, even if the wider society, in the case of SC State, was not going to provide enough money, and even if Claflin had to rely for many years on the support of the United Methodist Church or on white philanthropy. Even so, they were making efforts to produce the professional class, and most importantly, to produce Black teachers so that the children of the state and of the region could be educated in spite of neglect of the government. There was a wonderful program that I talked about at some length, the Rosenwald Program that existed from 1914 to 1932. And this was a wonderful example of Black constructive resilience. It was funded by a magnate. It was a person whose family had established Sears Roebuck Company. But it required an equal or greater match from the Black community. And so all over the South, there were 5,000 schools built by Black people who were determined to donate their own money, their own labor, their own sweat equity in order to educate their children. They raised money, they donated land, all these things they did, even though they were also paying taxes to school boards that refused to build schools for them. So this is the PD colored school. This is another school in York County. And then there was Clarendon County. Clarendon County, as you will recall, is that county that was right next to my home county. I put another image of that map on the right. So it's to the upper right, that Clarendon County. And in that particular case, in the 40s, a child drowned in Lake Marion, in part because of overdependence on canoes, because the white school board would not pay for school buses for Black children. And so these very brave parents, in several rounds, there were actually 3 separate cases, filed suit, and they gained as an attorney Thurgood Marshall. And in spite of harassment and threats from the local white community, they bravely arose to challenge the lack of equal expenditures for Black schools. And one of their community leaders was Reverend Delane, Joseph A. Delane, who's pictured on the upper right. Again, this theme of violence emerged. This is actually Reverend Delane with his family looking at the burnt out remnants of his home, which was burned down by white oppositionists. Not too long after Clarendon County arose and after Brown v. Board of Education, people in my hometown arose, quite often led by Black ministers, as on the upper right. And this picture to the left is my church. This is a rally, and I see several of my friends sitting on the front row. And so even as early as 1955, actually before the Montgomery bus boycott, people in my hometown arose and began to march and demand desegregation. And they've actually waged a boycott against local white businesses. And then there were quieter efforts to support this resistance effort. And so this is my nuclear family, my grandparents on the left, my parents in the middle, and my baby sister in my mom's arms, and myself. And so I talk about the quieter sacrifices that were made. I really spent quite a bit of time talking about my parents, who I think were the true heroes at the center of my own personal story. I also wanted to, as I mentioned, talk about the white allies, the potential for racial cooperation and racial unity. And so it was a surprise to discover that at key points, there were some that arose. On the left, the tall man, the tallest of them, J.B. Felton, worked with the Rosenwald Foundation, and he almost single-handedly brought together Black communities and white communities to finance and to construct 500 school buildings in the state of South Carolina. The judge in the Briggs v. Elliott case, as well as in other pivotal cases, was Judge J. Watis Waring. He's pictured in the middle. And then on the right, M. Hayes Mazzell worked very closely with the NAACP. He was with the Quaker-sponsored American Friends Associate Society during the heyday of school desegregation. And then I've mentioned as well, also the Baha'i community, a small but hopeful sign of this racial future, this interracial future. I highlighted two books that talk about this quite a lot. My friend Ricky Abercrombie's book, Crossing the Line, and my friend Louis Venter's book, No Jim Crow Church. And of course, because they've written those books, I couldn't write a book about Baha'is in South Carolina because they've already written that, but I wrote another book instead. So again, just to wind up, there was this effort to not put my own personal experience of my colleagues' experience with school desegregation at the center of the story, but to look at the wider trends, destructive trends, as well as constructive trends, and to take it up a little bit toward the present, to think somewhat about the future, and to just think about where trends are going. So I end the book I end in the conclusion by talking about the wisdom of Martin Luther King, as well as the Universal House of Justice, the leader of the Baha'i community, in terms of how we need to come together as brothers. Dr. King said, or we will die as fools, toward this better future, but we still have destructive and constructive forces that are at play now. So to recap, I hope that this book does bring to life this period for some people, that it does explore the nature of white supremacy during that particular era, but it also uplifts how Black communities did heroic work in terms of the conditions with which they lived. And that I also have demonstrated something about strands of hope for an interracial future. And there is more information at junemanningthomas.com or directly with the University of South Carolina Press.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. June. At this point, Dr. Fleming and I will moderate the questions, and then at some point we'll open it up to the wider audience. So with no further ado, I'd like for you to please go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thanks, Hoda, and thanks so much, June, for that overview, but also for the book. It's just really wonderful. From the moment we enter and you're talking about going back to your roots and having this encounter with a schoolmate who was not so nice, and the way you were able to sort of meet her where she was in the moment, but also not forget those traumas. It just really set up a book that kind of explores the roots of those violences, but also ways that we can move forward in the moment, and that plays out throughout the book. One of the things I was really interested in is something that you actually mentioned, which is the civil rights movement. And recently scholars have begun to rethink the civil rights movement and to really challenge what has come to be known as the short civil rights movement. Because, as you mentioned, it tends to prioritize heroes. It leaves a lot of everyday folk out, and we can go down the list. You're interested in a long framework, right? You take us from the 19th century forward, but you focus on the classical or the short phase, right? But you do so in a way that actually resists some of the criticisms that long civil rights movement scholars kind of target at that movement. So, for example, you aren't interested in heroes, and at the same time, you don't tell us that we have to go back to the 1930s or to communism, more radical forms of political protest to really locate radicalism. You focus on everyday people, college presidents, Black school teachers, Black children. And a part of what I walked away from the book really appreciating is the resilience and the resistance that you map at the same time that white supremacy obviously is unfolding. I'll mention one story. You talk about the NAACP petition and how there were all these Black people who signed it. And then I think the mayor of the town owned the Coca-Cola distribution or bottling company. He also was in charge of the dairy, and in retaliation, he stopped sending supplies to Black grocery stores. And so, of course, some of them had to capitulate. So I guess a part of what I'm saying is that could you talk about that nuanced way in which you give us a civil rights movement that is not a kind of a praise of heroes? It doesn't kind of cover over white supremacy, right? It holds these things in balance, while also kind of prioritizing everyday folk. Talk to us about that kind of representation of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I have lived long enough to remember it. So I was getting increasingly concerned because people would say, I even had a friend who had another person say to her, well, aren't you glad Rosa Parks sat on that bus? She freed you, It was sort of like, really? Because it's just so counter to the way I remember it. I remember it as a wholesale grassroots movement. And when you read certain narratives, like when you read, there's so many, like when you read people that really were there, not just in South Carolina, but in Mississippi. I'm thinking, for example, Cleveland Sellers' book, when you read books about people who were there and people who were going door to door and people who were sitting in rallies that may or may not have had the heroic figure, then you realize that this was a wholesale community effort. And it really permeate. I was chatting with one of my high school fellow first students just a couple of weeks ago, and we were remarking about the fact that when we were teenagers, when we were like 12, 13, our effort basically, or rather our contribution was to go march. We marched, or in my case, I wasn't allowed to, or we made signs, we helped make signs or something. But that was our highest aspiration, to be a part of this movement. And so people didn't have time to do other stuff. We were trying to get in the movement, and he was saying, well, it's different now. They don't have that cause. We had a cause. So this cause permeated my hometown and many other towns throughout the South. It wasn't about the heroes. It wasn't about the stuff that you see on TV, the newsreels, it wasn't about that. It was about everyday people getting up, going to the basement of the local church that was the headquarters, making signs, sending people out to picket for that day, greeting them back. If they were jailed, giving them food, making sure they were okay. It was about that. So I think, it really, we need a deeper understanding of what that movement meant to the people that were living at that time. And this is just one story. My story is one story, but there are other stories out there, and we need even more. So there are some people who are doing even more oral histories. We need more books about this so that we can understand this pivotal period. But at the same time, as you pointed out, it didn't just start then, And so people have been struggling. Like I went all the way back to a strike in Charleston in 1918. People were striking because Black teachers couldn't get jobs. So people have been fighting for a long time. People were fighting in the 1990s, to get school financing. It's a long struggle.
Thank you for that question. And June, can you talk more about the spiritual mission that you talk about in the book? What was the nature of this mission? Was it internal or external? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned that several times. Are you talking about the time when I talked about the spiritual mission of those of us who were in the schools, who had desegregated the schools?
Well, yes, just the nature of what it took, the spiritual nature of this movement, the resistance to not just go along with the status quo.
Yeah. Well, part of racism is this idea that the race in charge is the source of all good, and that the lesser race is anywhere from subhuman. I mean, the very worst of them would say subhuman, not even human, to retarded or immoral. So I kind of talk about that in one chapter, these slurs that some of these apologists were throwing around implied that Black people were immoral and not able to sit in a classroom. That's the topic I'm talking about, of course, sit in a classroom with pristine, pure white children. So that was part of the narrative. From our perspective, our counter narrative was, we seem to be the only decent people around, because we were kind of looking at these people and they were so immoral in the sense of when you think of, most of these people were all Christian, and they were essentially going against Christ's teachings, which were, you should love your brother as yourself. This was so obviously not the case. And so we were thinking to ourselves, how did they denude themselves into thinking they were superior, And of course, many of us were taking care of their children or cooking for them or maids. And so we saw them for real up close. So we knew this was no superior class, but we were told this so much. And all of the media supported this, that what happened to counter that was affirmation of how good we were. So I just have, especially in, I talk about my minister, Reverend McCollum's sermons, you could see that. I couldn't remember, but when I read his oral history, it came back just like that, because that's the way they talk to us. You are a noble person. You have God-given rights. You are actually superior because you are willing to love everyone. They are not. And of course, the they didn't help matters because they were being so incredibly inhumane to people of color for no other reason than because they had color in their skin. So it was such a crazy, wacky world where the people that truly were inferior in morality were in charge. And the rest of us, the really good people, we were the really good people because we were willing to love and to forgive, and we were willing to serve, all these things, there's one story, I didn't tell this story, but there's a story from the history of South Carolina State University that's written by Professor Hine. And so he talks about the things that the Black college did to try to survive when it had an all-white board of trustees, one of whom was openly hostile governor. And so they would make suits for the board of trustees. They would fix their cars. They would make their shoes. And there's a story that there was a fruitcake that some of the students would make. They would make fruitcakes and give them to prominent white citizens. And so one of the college administrators was delivering a fruitcake to one of these trustee members in Orangeburg. And as they were delivering the fruitcake to this person, the white person's dog bit the deliverer of the fruitcake. And the trustee said, just let him bite you. You know, just the hatred and the meanness was so incredibly unbecoming for human beings, much less people who considered themselves to be of any religious persuasion, So we were the spiritual warriors, you know. Those days when I was in school and it seemed when nobody was talking to me and I was getting spitballs thrown at me, you know, and this was like, you know, why am I doing this? You know, it was like, well, we're saving. I hope you understand the spirit in which I'm saying this, because it's not ego. It's just, it was a survival tool. We were saving America. That's how we felt. Like America couldn't live, it couldn't go on like this. This was embarrassing in the world at large, but we were saving America. And so I was proud, you know, I stayed. I had a chance to leave. I was offered a college admission after 11th grade. But I stayed because this was a cause. We were saving America. And it's too bad those people didn't understand that. So there was a deep feeling. I quote my classmate Tyrone. He says something the same. You know, he's quoted in the book that we had a cause. We had a purpose. We thought we were bringing about a new society. We didn't know everything would go backwards, you know, we thought it was going forward. We could not see the future, but we did our part.
Thank you.
Professor Thomas, I have a question for you, but I just want to thank you for the personal dimension of the book, and it worked so well with the kind of social movement history you were offering, the history of education. You obviously were a good student, and life, it turns out well for you. And as I read, I'm like, oh, wow, the daughter of a college president. And at one point you shake hands with the president of the United States and you get a full scholarship. But there were these really personal moments. I remember one when you mentioned that you have a boyfriend, and I'm reading, I'm like, oh, wow, finally the spicy part. And you mentioned, you know, by boyfriend, I mean someone I spoke to in the hall while we were changing.
Yeah, big deal.
Or, you know, when you go to the doctor, I think you mentioned that there's not a Black ophthalmologist, so you have to go to this segregated facility, and just, you know, the eye itself, how it becomes a site of violence. So I just really like how you fuse the personal into all of these different ways of telling the past that work really well. A part of that has to do with, you know, your father being president of Claflin, on the one hand, but also historically Black colleges more broadly. And you do such a good job of distinguishing between private versus public historically Black colleges, sort of what state appropriation of funds means in terms of what kinds of activism are possible. Can you just kind of walk us through the importance of, and I attended a historically Black college in Mississippi, just the importance of historically Black colleges to this fight for desegregation, but also now that we are seeing kind of record enrollments at historically Black colleges, we're seeing kind of endowments grow. What's the role of the historically Black college now in the fight for equality in education?
Well, certainly historically Black colleges, even now, they're the major producers of many specific professions. And certainly then there was no alternative. So there was no alternative until the 60s for Black students to go to a public school, college that was funded by state funds, you know, except South Carolina State. And that's true throughout the South. and throughout the country, but particularly throughout the South. That was where they were able to get public education, and that's where they basically they educated people who could go back and then educate children. That's the importance there. But they're also important because their plight illustrates that this system of segregation could not exist forever. So at the period that I'm describing, that had become clear as students realized that there was no place to get a medical degree that was state supported. There was no place to get an architecture degree, landscape architecture, and of course, law. I explained that that was fixed temporarily. But they were the wonderful support of the Black community, but they also could never catch up with the resources that were being poured into what were then white institutions. But they were wonderful in and of themselves, not just because they were an alternative for people that couldn't get into the schools. And so that's why they've survived, because there is a special quality with HBCUs. You know, I taught my whole career. Actually, that would take too long. I could really talk about the difference between teaching in 2 Big Ten universities, you know, as I have all of my career, and just being associated with an HBCU that just allows you to really focus on Black youth. Not that they're just Black youth, because now they have more diversity, but I often think about the contrast between my own career and my parents' career. I will admit that. I hinted at it in the book, but I will say it outright right now. You know, I really love my career, and I've done things that I wanted to do in my career, but I don't compare myself with my parents. My parents were the ones that really supported Black education, and they're the ones who raised up legions of people. So yeah, those schools, when my son, so we have a daughter and a son. The daughter went to University of Michigan, where I was teaching, and Michigan State also is where I taught. But our son, we looked around the country and considered he wanted to go into medicine, and we felt he would get lost at a Big Ten school. And so we sent him to Morehouse very happily. And sure enough, here are the advantages of Morehouse. Morehouse put him in touch with the CDC, you know, so that he was able to do internships with the CDC. When medical schools wanted to recruit Black students, they went to Morehouse. They didn't go to University of Michigan. They sent him to China. You know, he was interested in China, so he did study abroad. He had enormous opportunities. So HBCUs still have a niche. One of the things I talk about is how Claflin University has blossomed. You know, when my dad was president, it was like 400 students some years, 800 students in a good year. It's now over 2,000 students, and it's on the list of top 10 HBCUs. So it has just blossomed because it still has a place.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the world changed? Meaning, you know, as you move beyond the segregated moment to the desegregation, was it sharp before and after, or was it more subtle, ongoing? Are there things, or were there things that didn't make it? And were there some bad fruits which weathered on the vine?
It was sharp. It was a sharp change. And it's interesting because that's not the popular narrative. the popular narrative is that 1954 was a big change and 1964, but then everything's okay, But it was a sharp, in some ways hard and disappointing. Everything was not okay. And in order to get a sense of that everything was not okay when the Civil Rights Act passed, you need to look at schools. You can't look at lunch counters, you can't look at hotels, you can't look at public transportation, you can't look at buses, you have to look at schools. So in my opinion, the narrative that doesn't include schools doesn't really give a good picture of how well we transitioned from Jim Crow legalized white supremacy to a more open society, because those children were hidden. So the marchers went home, but the children had to get up every day and go to school. And in the public schools, that's where they had not only student hostility, but hostility from the teachers. And that's where gradually, as this person I was citing, Hayes Mazel, documented, you found Black teachers lost their jobs, Black principals lost their jobs. They were outranked by white principals and white teachers. Children started getting tracked. Children started getting more disciplinary problems. I really didn't explore that as much as I could have. That's a shorter chapter probably than it should have been. That's the chapter just before the conclusion chapter. But quite frankly, it was so dispiriting, and I'd already gone through a dispiriting period writing, I left that to other scholars to document, but there was a sharp decline in, I believe, the quality of education for Black children. And that's what Derek Bell was talking about, and that's what a lot of scholars have talked about, that this strategy, which was supposed to enhance the educational possibilities for Black children, actually should not have been the major strategy for improving Black education. There's nothing inherent about desegregating schools, although it was an important step. That did not necessarily increase the quality of education for Black children. And you see that today. I mean, that has carried forward. So we still are living in a society where the education of Black children is, in many cases, not just the South, but in the North and certainly, big cities, it's not up to par with the education of white children. And so that little short chapter, chapter 9, there were so many things that could have been covered. I only covered school finance, but I said, there's gotta be somebody that can write that book. I don't think I can take that on, but this is a real problem, this issue of quality of Black education.
Absolutely. So with your permission, and Julius, with your permission, I think there are some questions that have been posed by our audience, and let's go to those. And let's begin with the first one from Annalise Fonza. Hi, June. I look forward to reading your book, not online, but in paperback or hardback form. As you know, I was very excited to learn that your father was a former president of Claflin University, and I was thrilled when we collaborated on a trip that you made to Claflin while I was there working on my dissertation and teaching in 2 departments, including the Department of Religion. Your scholarship has been a guiding light for me and prominent in all of the classes that I teach even now. Can you say a little bit about how leaving your home state has benefited or limited you professionally? Thank you, and please know that many of us like you are still struggling to learn in the world that is still utterly divided along racial and political lines.
Yeah, so yeah. First of all, greetings to Annalise. It's been too long. I think it's clear in the book that I didn't intend to leave South Carolina and that I escaped South Carolina. I think the cumulative effects of growing up under Jim Crow, plus desegregating high school, plus desegregating university, finally, the toll was too much. And so for my own psychological well-being, as well as to find a major that I liked, I left South Carolina. But this book is in part, it's an ode to my home that I left. And there's a sad tone somewhat throughout the book because I make it clear, I didn't intend to leave. I did everything to make sure I wouldn't leave, you know, but it was necessary to leave. And it was necessary to follow the career that I wanted to follow. But it's something that had to happen, but this is a book written by a homesick woman. If it's not clear to the reader, I'll just tell you now. It is, but I have a wonderful life in Michigan. My husband's superb, you know, my children, you know, great jobs, but it was necessary to leave the South. I'm not sure what that feels like now for people who are I think it's surely not as bad. I mean, people, they're living there now, there's much more racial mixture. There's still separation, but it's not legalized the way it was when I was there. The signs are gone, you know, the colored and white signs are gone. But you know, unfortunately, racism lingers in our society. But I mean, that's true everywhere. It's true in Michigan, it's true in South Carolina. I have no idea. I know dear Annalise has left as well, but I have no idea what it's like now. I'm trying to get a better sense of that for young scholars. I've signed up for some of their Twitter feeds to just follow some of the South Carolina civil rights scholars. But they'll have to make that assessment if it's still a limiting factor.
Julius, would you like to read the next one?
Sure. So the next one is from Malik Wilson. As you have so graciously and intimately shared such a rich and personal history, you've inspired me to advance a question that perhaps I would generally only share around at the kitchen table or in the barbershop, certainly not in mixed company. You mentioned the tenacity, the determination, the almost impossible to comprehend commitment to uplift, particularly in terms of education. Given that white supremacy has always been a constant ambient noise and was even worse back then, is it we that have changed and lost our footing? Have we become more inferior and like them? I've worked in tutoring for years around Washington, D.C., and it is now the Eritreans, the Ethiopians, and the Chinese walking 5 miles to school, as it were. We don't, not like we used to, even in my own time. The $5,000 question, the elephant in the room, was integration the opening of a door in which our civilization's greatest accomplishments were diminished and lost to the wind, a grand kind of compromise with which our culture has never and will never recover from.
Oh, man. Gosh, can I get your email? I don't know. That really is a kitchen table discussion. I mean, you really, you know, I don't know. Something was lost. There was something lost. there are a couple of books that talk about that. One of them I cite, it's a study of education and teachers, schoolhouse activists, I think is the name of it, how different teenagers are now and youth are now compared to the days of the civil rights movement. That's a fascinating book that young woman has written. There is something very different. The drug culture did something. You know, there's some feeling that maybe that was even purposeful. You know, the same hometown that I talked about where we were eager to make picket signs and to march for freedom. You know, there's been some intrusion of the drug culture and gang culture, and yeah, something is different, but I feel a little distant. You know, I'm not sure. Someone on site needs to analyze, and even in Washington, D.C., I'm sure whoever that was, you know, Leek, I think you have a better sense of what's going on. And if you talk to maybe some of the older residents of the neighborhoods and the areas where you're from, you'll probably find there is a difference. We found that in Detroit. So most of my work with communities has actually been in Detroit, here in Michigan. And upon occasion, I have sat down and just talked to elderly residents of neighborhoods who talk about life, what life was like in the 60s or in the 90s and how things have changed somehow. So there's something about the prison industrial complex, the war on drugs. So it's not that we've become more inferior, it's that in some ways, some oppression was lifted and other oppression was put in place. So that's why I think we have to think about what are constructive forces, like what are constructive forces that are needed now. So the person who asked the question is involved in a tutoring program. That's one, you know, tutoring programs, activities, for junior youth, for young teenagers, or activities for youth. In some way, we have to counter those destructive forces, which might be even stronger now, and figure out what are the constructive ways that we can counter those and build up our children and youth.
Thank you. June, you should know that Malik Wilson works for the Baha'i Chair. So maybe one day you'll come down here or something and you'll meet. Michael Naylor asks, the resilience, wisdom, and moral ethics you mentioned parallel Newton science. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Against this blatant and dehumanizing history, Black parents, scholars have generated such a moral compass, creativity, and capacity to change humanity today. How do you see us increasing or mainstreaming these assets into education today? June, love the manner by which you calmly combine intellectual and emotional context as needed to actually embrace hard and relevant counter narratives to white/Eurocentric exceptionalism.
So my head was so turned by the praise, I forgot the question.
So how do you see us increasing or mainstreaming these assets into education today?
I really think there needs to be almost like a parallel educational process. There needs to be a parallel educational process. It's just really like we can talk about grand restructuring and improvement of the public educational system or of colleges and universities, but in terms of what a person can do or a community can do or a family can do, I think it has to be a lot of people working at a smaller scale. So, for example, some years ago, Richard and I started working with children in a nearby public housing development. And we just organized children's classes, which we're not offering now, but it's very small scale, but just offering some kind of values and moral training to these children for 3 years was such a wonderful experience for us and hopefully for them. There's a program, it's called the Ruhi Institute program, that has a curriculum for junior youth, as well as children's class materials. And that, I think, is very appropriate. That's associated, as you know, Hoda, with the Baha'i community. And we're beginning to see in some places, like in Los Angeles, where whole neighborhoods are having like all the neighborhood residents are putting their children and their junior youth in children's classes or junior youth programs as a parallel activity with the public school, so that they can use their free time in ways that build up character and that build up moral fiber. So I think really this is the kind of movement that we just have little seeds of this now, but this is the kind of movement that we need to start. This first classmate from Charleston that I mentioned, Tyrone, that I was talking to, he's a restaurateur, but he has started a daycare of all things. You know, he's the ex-military man who taught at the Citadel, but he has started a daycare that actually goes up through the elementary grades as a parallel to the public schools. And in this, he is inculcating values and concepts that can help them to improve their lives and the lives of their family. So in such ways, I think we might be able to see some improvement.
Julius?
Sure. So Professor Thomas, we have a comment that's, I think, praise, and then I'll ask a question. So the comment is, thank you for this book and balancing all of the negative that is clearly documented. Thank you for highlighting the positive. We need hope. This gives me hope. And then kind of maybe true, but also funny statement. Your book will be banned in Florida schools based on the governor's guidelines.
Okay. I think that's a badge of honor.
And then there's a question. So here's a question that I think Terry Gross will ask you when you're on Fresh Air. I know that talking about what you endured in high school was incredibly painful and difficult. How did you overcome that pain to dig so deeply into the experience and the broader topic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it took so long to write this book. I found pieces of narrative from the 90s, and there might be pieces from the 80s. It wasn't easy to write this book. It required me to remember bad memories and painful events in my life. So taking my time, I would stop for years at a time and write another book, and then I'd go back to it. Supportive family, particularly my husband, who kept encouraging me no matter how long it took. Prayer and meditation. I needed spiritual strength to write this book. And then archives. I am so enamored. Once I discovered the archives, I realized the book was possible, because I didn't have enough memories that I wanted to dig up to write a memoir. So I couldn't really write a memoir. I had to write a history book with little dashes of memoir. But the archives were absolutely essential, because someone else was keeping records and I could tap those records. And that's what I needed to get me through the task.
So there are many accolades that people are sending your way, and we'll be sure to copy those and send them to you. But here is the last question, June. From Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for an eloquent and engaging lecture and thoughtful discussion. I appreciate your reference to the simultaneous operation of constructive and destructive forces as ongoing processes. Based on your observation of the patterns of the past, what are your thoughts about the future in relation to these processes?
Yes, I think that right now, it seems as if the destructive forces have risen again. I know that it does feel that way. It feels as if, in particular, racism or supremacy has emerged in new clothing, so that it's not as evident as it once was. But because of my own faith and my own inclination, I do believe that in the long term, the constructive forces will win. So there's still that little girl warrior in me that is just eager to see those constructive forces win and triumph over evil.
Thank you very much. And I think that with that, we've answered we've answered all of the questions. First of all, I don't know how to thank you, June, because I know that this sort of program has a toll on you. It takes a toll. I mean, you visit places and things that are not so easy. And so for that, I'm grateful that you were willing to do this today. And Julius, I'm very happy and grateful that you were accompanying me on this journey today, and really appreciate your being with us. And I want to just remind the audience that the book is, you can get it anywhere. You just need to Amazon and all the other carriers of books. And I really encourage you to get the book, read it, make presents of it to other people, because this history that June has captured for all of us in this book, it's so important for us to know about, and especially for our children, especially. And I don't just mean Black children, okay? This, I in fact mean the other children, you know, that this is a history that we need to talk about, tell stories about to children, because it's so much a part of the history of America. And as June said, America cannot be a great nation unless the African American population is truly equal in that society, in every way and in every manner. And until that happens, we will not have reached the potential of this country. So I want to thank Dr. Thomas, Dr. Fleming again for being with us today. And I would like to just make one announcement, if I may, before we say goodbye to our audience. It's our next event, which is scheduled on May 5th, 2022 at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It features Professors Michael Allen, Dr. Kate Seaman, and myself. We are the three editors of a book we just published on the fundamental challenges of global peace and security. And the event will be moderated by our graduate student, Ms. Stella Hudson. We're very happy that she will do this for us. And the book is quite timely. If we didn't plan it this way, but given the nature of what is happening in the global order today, the book is really quite timely. And what we will do is actually discuss what is in the book, because it's comprised of many chapters written by wonderful experts in international relations and political science and other fields. And I think it's very important to look at how they foresee an alternative to the current global order, which is not functioning as we would like it to function. So it provides new ways of understanding the cultural, the political, and spiritual relations that form the basis of any interaction between nations and an international community. So we hope you will join us on May 5th. And again, my thanks to Dr. Thomas and Dr. Fleming. And Dr. Thomas, wishing you all the best with the sale of this book. And we look forward to your next book that will further illuminate our understanding of the world. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Goodbye.